Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone, and welcome to today's WoodMac Focus session. We're delighted that you've all joined us, and we are delighted to have the support of our exclusive sponsor, Copperleaf, for this session. My name is Neeraj Nandurikar, and I am a Senior Vice President in Wood Mackenzie Consulting with responsibility for our global power and renewables consulting business, as well as our Americas consulting business, which includes 6 different practices, including power and renewables. So thank you for joining us. We're delighted you're here. Just a few housekeeping items before we kick off the session. Number one, we would really love to receive questions for our speakers. So please submit those via the Ask a Question button or box on the left of your screen. These questions, by the way, will be asked anonymously, so please be open and candid with your questions. Given the time frame that we have for the 2 sessions, 30 minutes for the first one, 40 minutes for the second one, what we will do is we will collect those questions and we'll answer the questions at the very end rather than throughout. But please do submit those questions, because even if we can't get to all of your questions live today, we will definitely get back to you, and somebody from the team will follow up with you and respond to your question in the coming days. So definitely do that. Second, we will be sharing the recordings of this session with everybody who's registered. So you will receive a link from the team, possibly tomorrow, with the link to the recording. So again, everybody will get a recording of the session today. And lastly, if you do encounter any sort of technical difficulties during this session, please refer to the FAQ tab on the right of your screen, and that should walk you through some of the common issues people are facing. So with that underway, let's get ahead with the session. So at Wood Mackenzie, as I said, I work at Wood Mackenzie. Much of the work that my colleagues and I do for our clients typically involve various aspects of energy transition and the impact energy transition is having on all the sectors that we deal with, right? And these impacts may include the need to look at technologies and solutions in response to stakeholder or investor pressure to reduce Scope 1 emissions, or say the need to decarbonize a portfolio that a client has, or it may even involve existing operations and supply chains that are also subject to energy transition. And that creates an additional layer of complexity that has to be managed. And at the same time, energy transition is also creating a positive impact in that it creates a white space. So new opportunities, new businesses, new industries that clients can capitalize on or enter. So the impact of energy transition doesn't always have to be negative. There are also lots of opportunities that are arising out of all this. Now, this is certainly true for all the industrial sectors that we deal with, including utility. At WoodMac, we work with several utility customers, as does PowerAdvocate, which is one of the companies, part of the Verisk and WoodMac family. And as a group, this set of clients, the utilities, are certainly at the forefront of energy transition, both in terms of the impact on that sector, on utilities, as well as the impact the utilities will create through their response to energy transition. So we're already seeing a lot of utilities respond to energy transition, in particular in tackling Scope 1 emissions through major investments in renewables, for instance. But we are also starting to see a bit of progress on Scope 2 aspects, right, the operational aspects, and some progress on Scope 3, which is tackling energy transition in the utility supply chain. But there's a little bit more room to work on that aspect, a little bit more nascent in that area. But we are starting to see utilities go beyond just changing their generation mix and really put a broader focus on energy transition and the entire ESG, environmental, social, governance aspects of it. In fact, a large number of utilities that we deal with are already establishing ESG performance goals. The ES environmental goals focus on renewables and meeting greenhouse gas emissions and reductions and other environmental metrics. The social goals focus on how they are working with their customers and local communities that they within the footprint they operate in, while the governance aspects deal with focus on governance and accountability issues. And what utilities are discovering is that these interwoven elements of ESG and the impact that has on sort of the generation resource planning and generation resource decision making, and the impact ESG has that just goes beyond the generation resource planning. So in this event, what we want to do is actually focus on how these ESG goals impact utilities, power generation, resource, and overall portfolio mix and decision making. This could include retiring generation assets with renewable assets or replacing retiring generation assets with renewable assets, deciding to replace existing fossil-based assets or repower existing fossil-based assets to support community employment goals, or maybe understand ESG performance and practices of the entire utility supply chain, say, for example, solar panels. So with all these decisions that utilities have to focus on, they also have to worry about accountability to their customers, their shareholders, and of course, their regulatory commission. So how do utilities handle this multi-layered approach to ESG? Well, we have the right experts to help us understand this. So in this first half an hour, Erin Carroll and Andrew Jean-Louis will set the stage for us, and actually for the subsequent panel discussion in the second half, where we'll talk to decision makers from Evergy and Alliant Energy, as well as get a view from Copperleaf Technologies with how they support decision making related to asset planning, and what are the common themes we are seeing in the industry. So with that, let me introduce our panelists for this half hour. First, we have Erin Carroll. Erin is a Senior Vice President in PowerAdvocate's consulting group, and she's responsible for managing utility client engagements with a specific focus on overall supply chain effectiveness for both capital projects as well as the operations and maintenance effort. This has included capital project procurement, as well as directing the development of various procurement strategies and plans and procedures for her clients. Erin leads PowerAdvocate's renewable practice area and was most recently named the Transition Economist Top 100 Women of the Energy Transition. Erin, welcome and thank you. We also have Andrew Jean-Louis. Andrew is a managing director also in PowerAdvocate's consulting group and is responsible for overseeing the work of various consulting teams that drive value at a variety of energy companies and utilities through a combination of data analytics, supply chain strategy development, and organizational design or redesign. He's done a lot of work in post-merger integration work, supply chain transformations as well. Andrew also leads PowerAdvocate's risk and ESG practice area. And in fact, he will be moderating the second half of this session with the industry panelists that we have, and really talking about the intersection of power generation, utility, and ESG performance. So thank you, Andrew, and welcome. So before we get into sort of a discussion and maybe a question and answer, maybe Erin, do you want to kick us off with any opening thoughts you may have on this ESG topic?
Sure. Thanks, Niraj. As Niraj mentioned, the focus of this discussion is how ESG is considered when thinking about power generation investments. We've seen this playing out with our clients in a variety of ways. When we started this, greenhouse gas goals had led to a number of utilities adding renewables to their generation or thinking about transitioning, and that included solar, wind, hydrogen, batteries, anything that would be a renewable asset. we tend to support our clients once they have made the decision with regards to their greenhouse gas goals. So their environmental scope 1 decisions are already made. They know the emissions. We get involved when they're thinking about how to procure the material, the services for that new asset, and how they're going to operate and maintain them. So ESG comes back into play with these environmental concerns when you think about scope 2 emissions, which are the energy consumed by the internal operations of these new assets, and the scope 3 emissions, which are the energy generated through the supply chain, or the emissions generated through the supply chain. Andrew will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to focus on the S and G of the ESG considerations. The social and governance issues are not as easy to quantify as the environmental measures. We can all wrap our head around greenhouse gas. It's a number. I love numbers. We can understand the number. But that is not the be-all and end-all. The S and the G are becoming increasingly more important as we make decisions. So governance issues, we tend to support our clients in providing market insights and analysis to really demonstrate that the investments they're making are a prudent use of ratepayer funds. The market's crazy right now, as you all know. So what is fair market value? How do we navigate through this market? I think, and those are pretty straightforward. The social issues are really the most complex, I think, in this ESG metric. These issues include understanding the impact of that generated asset on your existing employees, understanding it on the local community, and really understanding the renewable supply chain and how it impacts the decisions of what you're going to buy. You know, in the last 6 months, the solar industry, the solar module industry has really been hit hard by these issues. There's been manufacturing concerns that had to be addressed. Those included issues around forced labor, as well as the energy source that's used when you generate the material. Our clients have addressed this by now including questions in all their bid events to really dig into their suppliers. Where do you manufacture? How do you manufacture? And give us details as to how you are addressing the social issues of these products. That is something that we didn't see for the longest time. I decided I'd put in solar, I'd buy my panels, and I'd move forward. These issues are all coming to the forefront now because they are part and parcel of what you have to look at to really understand the full cost of transitioning to the renewable environment. I think as a result, what's going to happen is as we continue to really look at the breadth of ESG, our portfolio mixes might still have to change a bit to accommodate a balanced ESG approach. So I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years as we continue this transition and we expand our thinking beyond the financial investment and the greenhouse gas emissions to the prudency of the full investment in that renewable asset. So with that, I will pass it along to Andrew.
That's great. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah.
Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd love to. Really pleasure to be here and speaking with you all. I want to harp on one component within this ESG space, and it's the role that supply chain can have when it comes to driving corporate ESG performance, because they're positioned where they're managing billions of dollars of capital and operational spend. They're managing thousands of suppliers that are providing the necessary goods and services required to deliver both new and maintain existing assets. So supply chain is really well positioned to shape the behavior and the business of those thousands of suppliers to help the organization achieve those ESG goals. And as I think about ESG risk when it comes to power generation and their investments, there are really these two buckets that I categorize investments in. It's really the existing assets, the current mix of generating assets, how you're going to maintain and retrofit and retire those. And then the new assets that are emerging. So those need to be brought online. They're increasingly becoming more renewable. And each of those buckets have different considerations within the ESG space because everything requires investment, decision-making to help with utility achieve their long-term goals. Yeah. So in this new asset bucket, Aaron's been talking a little bit about many of the considerations in the ES and G component. When it comes to supply chain's role, there are a lot of challenges to overcome. And the first priority is delivering these renewable projects and navigating the international geopolitical challenges that we're seeing all over the world in terms of inflation and global shortages and regulatory hurdles that are being built in response to what we're seeing in the social dynamic across the globe. So in the new asset space, there's lots to sort out, and supply chain plays a really big role in sorting all of that out and getting the right panels in time for projects to be delivered. And then you have your existing assets, which right now takes up the majority of generation capacity. And that does have an opportunity to drive performance in the ESG space. As utilities need to make really important decisions on what assets are going to be retired, what needs to be maintained at what level, and what just needs to be retrofitted because that's a better option than a new build. All those activities require really extensive involvement from supply chain, not only to facilitate execution against those plans, but also to ensure that all relevant ESG considerations guide evaluations and decision making. It's not just about bottom line and how much things are going to cost. It's about what are the impacts going to be on the community and the customers that utility is looking to serve. So looking at both new and existing assets, regardless of what category you're in, you're going to be dealing with these emerging challenges, and supply chain's positioned to help. Generation owners really need to drive progress in a couple of areas that I'm seeing. It's first, doing business with diverse suppliers. That touches on the social component. I also think that second, doing business with the local economy, right? Providing opportunities for local suppliers to get involved in delivering these projects. And finally, it's this nascent area around managing emissions. All those three areas are either mature or nascent, but all provide really good opportunities for supply chain to help drive corporate initiatives. As I think about ESG performance on a programmatic level, because there are things that have been done for decades and things that are new, it's really helpful to think about it in this 4-part framework where first you need to define the scope of what you're talking about within that domain. So what's the definition? How does it align with corporate goals? Second, you need to measure your performance. What's the current performance? What's the historical performance? What's the trend over time? And hopefully that can help inform goal setting into the future. And third and fourth would be assess the opportunities for improvements and ultimately perform against your opportunities. And if you take that 4-part structure and apply it to a space like diverse suppliers, you can find ways to further what is already a mature program. But if you take that same framework and apply it to a new program like Scope 3 emissions, it gives you some framework to think about what are the data, resources, and processes I need to make improvements in this area. So with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Niraj to lead us along here.
That's great, Aaron and Andrew. Thank you. I mean, that really gives a nice flavor of the context that utilities find themselves when dealing with ESG, certainly creating some interesting dynamics, interesting analysis that they have to consider. Maybe let me just start with a couple of questions before we sort of move on to the industry panel. But maybe, Aaron, I'll start with you. When we think about this ESG, it seems like E, or the environmental side related goals, were the first avenues explored by utilities, right? Moving the generation mix to renewables, tackling the E piece. When did social start becoming a concern, and is it enough of a concern, or there is still a lot of room to get better at it? Can you provide some perspective there?
Sure, Niraj. In 2017, 2018, we started to see a lot of ESG pilot programs. IOUs, investor-owned utilities, were publishing the fact that they were exploring this and thinking about it. And, some of them had already even started to install renewables at that point. I think this has really stepped up in the last 2 years. You see now investment funds that say, we are judging what we're going to invest in based on an ESG rating, right? They want to make sure that their investments have ESG and sustainability goals. And if you look at a view of websites of different utilities, you will find stated ESG goals. So I think it was a combination of customer awareness that said, hey, we want to reduce the climate change, and truly investment firms that said, we are going to invest in green type industries. I think the interesting part of this is that, the prudency issues and thinking about the cost to the ratepayers is another social piece that I don't think we've really explored in depth. And I think there's a lot of room to move there to really understand for all of your customer base, all of your stakeholders, which includes customers. Is this fair to all of them? Is this a prudent use of money, right? We have to make sure that we don't leave people behind as we continue this transition, right? Because we want to preserve the climate, we want to make some big changes, but we have to make sure that it is affordable and it treats everyone equally. So I think there's a lot more we can do on the social side as we continue to look at the total ESG score.
Thank you. I really like the framing of that, which is it's not just about the labor or the way for example, solar panels were made, but also looking at the ratepayer as part of the S piece of the ESG is really sort of an expansive way to think about it. Andrew, maybe a similar thing for you is when you think about supply chain, how have sort of the power generation or the utility supply chains considered or are considering the ESG risks? Is it enough? Are they doing it properly? You talked about this 4-step framework. Is that being applied? Any perspectives you can provide there?
Yeah, happy to. The short answer is it's evolving. It's changing by the day. I think historically for decades, supply chain has looked at diverse suppliers as the entry point to ESG and almost was ahead of the wave of ESG considerations that we're seeing over the past couple of years. And in those diverse supplier programs, they really are engaging with suppliers, not just from here are my current set of suppliers and here's what I think can do business, but they're leveraging data to find out what are the ways to expand business with diverse suppliers, what are the ways to find alternate diverse suppliers. And what's happening in parallel is folks are engaging with local suppliers too. Like who are the folks within the service territory that can deliver services that have direct ties to expanding diverse amount of suppliers, but also have ties to thinking about emissions and working with local businesses as opposed to international or other regions of the states here. So there's the social component that's almost ahead of the game. And what's new and emerging is a scope 3 thing. And the scope 3 thing is getting more interesting as more pressure is being put on organizations, and we're trying to figure out what that can mean for supply chain involvement.
Okay. So when we sort of think about, you use the word sort of evolving, it's still progress being made, but still more ways to go. When we think about, the future of ESG risk, if you will, or maybe the future of ESG as it applies to utilities as we go through the energy transition. Erin, maybe I'll come to you. What do you see as the future risk that ESG may impart on these companies as part of the energy transition? What should they be aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as we uncover more of the supply chain, as we, really dig into these issues and ask these questions, right? We no longer can say we did a good thing because we put this renewable asset in and we're reduced emissions. We are uncovering things that make us stop and ask questions, right? That make us stop and say, okay, the raw materials I'm putting into this, have I considered where they come from? Have I considered how much energy it takes to build this thing? I mean, this is an issue that we are now becoming more and more aware of. And I think that we're going to force some change in behavior. When you think about the withhold and release order recently on polysilicon in the US, we're starting to see some firms change their approach to how that poly is going to be made, right? They're going to use different labor sources because it's still a market they want to participate in. So they're going to change some practices. Is it going to impact everything and can we solve it all on one fell swoop? Absolutely not. But I think the more we learn, the more we can figure out how we're going to address it. And I think it could influence some decisions and timing of different efforts as we move forward in this energy transition.
Great. Andrew, if I sort of maybe add similar question to you, right? When we talked about sort of the risks, but let's sort of maybe look at the other side of this and say, if we think about where is the white space that you see for utilities when it comes to, say, organizations aligning and actually achieving their ESG goals. So if I take your sort of four-step framework, right, you had define performance, measure, assess, and ultimately your last one was actually perform.
Right.
And so we use that and say, okay, where is the white space, right? And how do organizations align and achieve these goals? How would you help them go about this?
Yeah, I'll try to break it down into these two buckets, where there's this bucket of activities that are tried and true and have pretty much matured. So the diversify program again, right? Like they've already defined, they've already measured performance, and they know what the opportunities are and spot performance. And that performance is empowered by data. It's empowered by understanding the landscape of the market, who's out there, who they can interact with, and what impacts their expansion of diverse supplier business can impact. But on the flip side, you have these more nascent components within ESG, like Scope 3. And the white space is really about defining and measuring when it comes to Scope 3. Because Scope 3 is complicated. There's the upstream and the downstream activities. So how do you understand what's within your scope? What are the things that you have more control over than others? You need data, you need to talk to suppliers, you need to talk to folks in operations, and you really need to collect the view of, what do we mean by Scope 3 at our organization for our specific intersection of industry, geography, and customer base? And moving forward, how can that lead to a measurement that is reflective of current performance and again, really inform where we're going to go? Because understanding the Scope 3, where you're trying to go with Scope 3 in terms of reductions, can help provide clarity as to, at a corporate level, what are realistic net zero targets that I can achieve, not just from primary generation sources, but also from Scope 3 in combination. And I think as the Scope 3 area becomes more mature, that'll play a more central role when it comes to net zero discussions.
Well, that's quite helpful. Maybe one last question before we go to our industry panel. Aaron, I'll come to you maybe. Andrew, talk a little bit about the data and try to understand sort of what data you have that tells you sort of where you sit. Maybe just circling back to the social aspect where we started, and maybe even the E aspect. How does a utility even begin to understand how the generation mix even impacts the social goals, right? I mean, you started off by saying we like numbers. With the environmental side, there is a number. How do we get to that place on our generation mix's impact on social? What numbers do we look for?
Yeah, it's a lot harder, and we don't have numbers. We have big issues, right? And the first is, like I said, informing ourselves about the issues, right? So that we can dig into them and understand them. We've got a lot of clues that are out there. We've seen what's happened in the past, right? So now we can ask more questions. And I think, more and more of our utility customers are adding these types of questions. And we expect to have answers for those questions from our bidders. And if they don't provide those answers, we don't score them as highly, because that transparency is going to be what is going to help us understand the issues. Can I assign a number to it yet? Not yet. Somebody more clever than I will probably come up with a methodology as to how we will assign that. But I think right now we're still in a lot of the discovery phases to make sure. I mean, we're starting to see new standards roll out for, robustness in supply chain, for, sustainability and recycling, for different manufacturing. We just have to keep an eye on those and make sure we ask the bidders those questions.
Yep.
Right,
and I'll quickly layer on, if you don't mind. I mean, the reality is the social component is so qualitative, and we're not going to be able to jump to a quantitative answer, right? So it's about having conversations. It's about setting expectations. And when you go out to market and feel, an RFP, a big component can't just be price. It has to be like, what can you do in the sustainability realm? What's your plan as an organization? And make that expectation so that it forces companies to start thinking about, I can't just be cost competitive. I need to be socially competitive. And that's definitely an emerging trend that I'm seeing in the market.
Yeah, and I think I suppose what you're highlighting is at least by having those questions included in the bid documents, right? That's a step that's shining a light on those issues and at least creating a step to start gathering the data and creating a visibility that this is no longer just a topic we talk about, but we're actually starting to collect information and use it in our decision-making process. So sort of goes to your define the performance and start measuring the performance elements that Andrew sort of talked about in the four-step framework. I think this has been great. So thank you both, Aaron and Andrew. I think I'll just end with this. Reminds me the data discussion of a phrase I had once read in my ex-boss's office, and it basically said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." So I think as we talk about collecting data for these difficult but important issues, I think it certainly underscores the need for that. So I just want to thank you, Aaron and Andrew, for this insightful setup. I think it sets our second panel where we'll actually talk to industry experts who are dealing with this day to day. So I think we'll get to hear from them on how they think about ESG when they make these big, long-term, impactful investment decisions. So thank you, everybody. As I said, we'll go into the second panel right away. Keep your questions coming, and we will address them towards the end. So thank you both, and we'll get to the second panel.
Thank you, Neeraj.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us here today. During the roundtable, you heard Aaron, Neeraj, and myself speak a little bit about two key topics, right? The increasing renewable migration in generation portfolios, supply chain operations evolving to consider ESG topics, and how all that is interrelated. In this discussion, we'll be getting the opportunity to chat with several individuals who had the chance to drive both corporate progress and ESG progress. So it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel here that I have the privilege of moderating. So to introduce our panelists, I'll start with you, Jason. Jason Humphrey is Evergy's Senior Director of Renewables and Assistant Treasurer. Justin has been with Evergy for over a decade, working in generation, Lean Six Sigma process improvement, M&A integration stemming from the legacy KCP and Westar merger a few years back, and finance and treasury. Jason's renewables development group has primarily been responsible for Evergy's addition of over 1,300 megawatts of new owned renewable capacity over the next 5 years. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Andrew. Happy to be here.
Great. So Bodwin, thanks for joining us. Bodwin Nyans is Copperleaf's Chief Marketing Officer. He is also a board member of the Institute of Asset Management and chair of the Canadian Committees for ISO and on asset management and IEC on managing electrotechnical assets. Bodwin has extensive experience in international business development, including having led development of graphic arts giant Creo in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and later led all market activities for Creo worldwide. Bodwin is an avid sailor and manages the fleet of volunteer search and rescue vehicles in British Columbia, which allows him to apply a real-time risk-based decision-making and asset management firsthand. Very interesting stuff. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And ultimately, last but not least, Ben Lapari. He is the Director of Project Development and Customer Solutions for Alliant Energy in Iowa and Wisconsin. Ben leads a development team focused on partnerships with renewable developers and suppliers to develop, acquire, and construct renewable projects. Alliant is the third largest regulated owner of operated wind sites and continues to advance a balanced portfolio of resources, including announcement that will add over 1.4 gigawatts of solar in Wisconsin and Iowa through 2024. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Great. Well, let's get the show on the road here. This first question deals with power generation and the intersection of environmental and emissions, because ultimately the most obvious impacted domain within ESG when you think about power generations is emissions. So I'll pass this over to Ben or Jason, whoever wants to take it first, but it'd be great to hear more about what each of your organizations are thinking about along the topic of emissions and what you have in the pipeline to help deliver against those emission-related goals.
Yeah, I'll take this, Andrew, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. As we think about the intersection between power generation and emissions, certainly there are emissions scope that are kind of older, more well-controlled emissions, NOx, SOx, but a lot of the focus going forward has been on CO2. And so Evergy has a net zero target by 2045 with a pretty aggressive interim goal of 70% from a 2005 level along the way, and by 2030. And so it really requires both. As we listened to the panelists in the first half hour, we talked about the scope control for existing asset sites and then that for new renewables. And so for our existing sites, figuring out how to efficiently dispatch those into the market and control technologies that reduce our emissions, but also keep the operations flexible to allow new renewable resources to stretch their legs are intimately important. Combined with that, we have the new build that my group is responsible for. And so here between now and the middle of the decade, we'll add about 1.3 gigawatts of new renewables between solar and wind that will also support and offset some of those legacy generators that are more carbon heavy and have us on a good path to our 70% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2045.
Great, thanks, Jason. And Ben, I'd love for you to layer on to see what Line Energy is up to in the emission space.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me. So we've shared a clean energy blueprint with stakeholders and regulators in both Wisconsin and Iowa. For power generation, it's primarily focused on the transition from coal-fired facilities to renewables and renewable enabling technologies. The plan focuses on serving customers affordably. So if we, quickly dive into what these investments mean across the ESG continuum, we see affordability as being a key tenet of how our plan translates to positive impacts for our customers. These new technologies are going to continue our excellent reliability of the system while also adding resiliency to the grid. So it's intended to be not just what are going to be that next generation of power and energy to meet customers' needs, but also recognizing that the change and transition of those resources is going to have an impact on how that grid is able to be operated and ultimately the reliability of how that grid needs to be able to serve our customers as well. We see a grid that's been increasingly stressed due to extreme weather, mentioning the dramatic change in operational profiles of these new assets with wind and solar compared to the more baseload dispatchable resources of the past, as well as keeping up with trends that are introducing more dynamic needs from our customers. Equally as important to the plan is a focus that we have for strengthening the communities that we serve. So our growing renewable portfolio is providing us opportunities to partner with landowners that are actively involved in our projects, community groups that have an interest in the economic development of the rural areas that make up our footprint, as well as, adding critical jobs and wages that support families and local businesses in our communities. So that's a bit about, what are the highlights of our transition. You mentioned, we're the third largest regulated operating wind farms nationally. That's a product of just over 1 gigawatt that we brought into service by the end of 2020. We'll continue to do wind and see our next phase being dominated by solar. You mentioned the 1.4 gigawatts. That's a healthy first step with more to follow. And then, of course, we expect some of the battery storage technologies to integrate at these sites that we've now established from a renewable standpoint to expand the value that they can provide to the grid and to our customers.
I appreciate it, Ben. Definitely a few important key themes around corporate goals on emissions, as well as keeping the customer in mind and making sure that the community is also part of decision making. Really important stuff. Audwin, I know Copperleaf isn't a utility generator, but you're very much connected to the industry. Would love to get your perspective quickly about what you're seeing in that intersection between power generation and ESG.
Oh, well, the obvious intersection is the fact that power generation is worth about 1/4 of the GHG emissions in the world. So that's both the problem and the opportunity there, of course, right? Because that means that it's relatively easy for the power generation organizations to make a massive contribution, as both Ben and Jason were outlining. So it very quickly goes down to the numbers, right? Like we talked about it earlier. You can only manage what you can measure. So carbon accounting becomes key, and by extension, you're starting to see a lot of utilities and generators in particular now who are really starting to use avoided emissions as a key metric in their decision making. So not only in the big scope 1 decisions, as in am I putting in a new wind farm, but also for everyday decisions like am I replacing the vehicles in my fleet, and in doing so am I going for old gas guzzlers again, or are we going electric? And that is very largely driven by carbon accounting or emission accounting, basically. So that's something that we see a lot. And that actually becomes really part of the decision-making framework that the organizations are putting in place, wider frameworks, which can include other ESG factors, of course, but certainly on the emissions side is a key one, yeah.
I appreciate it, especially the point made around how the carbon emissions isn't just about the primary generation, it's also about utility operations, electrification, and driving decision-making based on data and carbon accounting. So that's a really great perspective. I do want to ask a question around some of the ESG, more specifically, the emissions type commitments that I heard both you, Ben, and Jason mention. I'm curious how those corporate emissions that are announced on Wall Street trickle down and actually impact decision making on the project planning level. Like, how does those commitments inform what you do on a day-to-day basis as you work to deliver these major projects?
Ben, you want to take first on this one?
Sure. So Jason referenced some of the ambitious, I give Jason and the team quite a bit of credit. Those are very ambitious goals and emission reduction targets that they have. Ours are similar. We have aspirations of reaching net zero by 2050, being completely out of our coal by the end of 2040. As it stands, our progress has been very good. We're going to be completely out of our wholly owned coal by the end of 2025. And we'll establish further plans to meet those broader targets. To your question, Andrew, so much of our planning revolves around these established kind of targets and expectations that we've set with our stakeholders. And, I suppose we really internalize this. This is a product of our values. This is us believing that we're walking the talk. And so while we've got larger investments, that can be explained by transitions of coal to renewables, and we'll see less gas introduced into the portfolios of the future. It's utilities needing to get farther upstream to kind of hit on some of the supply chain themes that were introduced earlier, so that we're more prepared to adopt some of these emerging technologies, so that we do give ourselves a path to achieve these goals where, getting 70, 80% of the way there is, pretty well within our control today. But getting that last 20% will be quite difficult. And we're going to have to, as Aaron Carroll was mentioning earlier, really advocate for the market and suppliers to move quickly and to be very innovative such that we can have a chance at meeting those targets.
Yeah, I think those broad corporate overlays end up in meaningful trickle downs, but as the first half hour started, you kind of get busy doing what you measure. And so some of this for us and how the goals are manifested is really understanding where we are today. And so the Edison Electric Institute has had a reporting framework around carbon for quite some time. But as the industry becomes more mature around this, we've incorporated the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD framework. We've incorporated the SASB framework for reporting. And with each of these different slices of the pie, we begin to tell a different story. A lot of the financial backers of our industry, folks who own fixed income debt or equity positions, have really recently focused on coal as a percentage of revenue or coal as a percentage of rate base. Revenue is a tough thing to measure for a utility. Rate base is something that's relatively easily known. And so as recently as Evergy's Investor Day presentation this year, we started to look at and report on at a consolidated Evergy level, coal as a percentage of rate base and working on declining that number. That's going to therein support the reduction in carbon emissions because there's less usage there, but that also means there's less reinvestment. And so as we think about the capital deployment strategy, all the way from maintenance capital to the big new builds that Ben and I work on, you think about that all the way through the supply chain and really focus on, okay, maybe it meets my E metric, but what can we do from an S and a G standpoint? So we really do look and have corporate goals around diverse suppliers and supporting tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers through diverse spend. If we hire a GE or a Siemens or somebody to do a wind farm, is there an electrical contractor who's diverse that they could help support that local economy with? And then that flows to the G, which is often the one that's not talked about, but is critically important to making sure you land in the right place. And so we have an ESG committee internally that helps work on that reporting and framework, but they also set that kind of global corporate plan and governance around how do we make these investment decisions and how do we make sure that we're really working on Evergy's kind of three-legged stool of reliability, affordability, and sustainability? Without all three of those, we get off kilter. There's very few businesses that are more local than your local utility. We got an office in pretty much every small town we serve. And so we really do have to think about all three of those pillars as we move our capital plan forward, even though we've got these large corporate targets of 70% or net zero carbon reductions.
I appreciate that, Jason. But before I move us on to talking a little bit more about the social and governance piece, because it's all interwoven, I do want to ask Bodwin a question around the emissions piece and the carbon accounting specifically. There's emerging technologies and ideas and frameworks around carbon accounting. Would love to get perspective on how utilities are leveraging this white space and working to evolve it to a point where they can use it to drive decision making.
We would love to get clarity in that space, that's for sure. There's a few too many models out there. It's interesting because what you find is in different places around the world, consensus might go in different directions. So if I look at what's going on in the UK or actually in Denmark, I'm in Denmark right now, where there's actually tons of wind being used for generation. But I also discovered that Ethernet is pretty crummy. So if I freeze every once in a while, that's been happening for the last half hour. I'm in a hotel here, and it's not too great. But what we've seen is, around the world, you'll find different models I use for carbon accounting. I do think that we're coming towards a consensus, like GRI-based and other models are coming to the forefront. And what we do is we essentially take those models and we actually build them into the decision-making frameworks so that effectively every project can be evaluated pretty quickly with regards to what it's going to contribute to the emission reduction. And actually, we do that in the broader sense too, like in listening to Ben and Jason about how to operationalize a lot of these bigger ESG targets that organizations are putting in place. It's quite interesting to see how companies do that. Very often, this whole issue of valuing that was also mentioned earlier by Aaron is a big one because carbon accounting is something we can at least understand. I mean, it is numbers based. If you're looking at customer satisfaction, okay, well, that's kind of halfway there. If you're getting into the real soft stuff like community engagement, et cetera, how do you measure that and how do you actually account for that in a decision-making framework? That's something in which a lot of work has been happening lately to actually get to the point where you can actually kind of give a score, an ESG score, if you wish, to every project in your organization, some kind of a normalized score, so that you can say, well, this project actually kind of gives us a better ESG return than another project. And of course, you tie in the finance to that, or the traditional metrics that you might have as an organization, so that eventually you wind up with a single value framework that allows you to decide what's the value to the organization in aggregate of every single project, and then you can start kind of comparing apples to oranges to elephants, or that's the idea anyway. It's work in progress for most organizations, but it's something which is becoming increasingly important because of the amount of factors that we're trying to kind of drive at the same time. Carbon being, of course, one big one in that context.
I really appreciate you highlighting the value-based approach to project feasibility. That's definitely a step change because it used to be all about cost. Now it's about not cost. It's about the whole picture. It's about how it impacts ESG and how that can drive results. So I really appreciate that. So I do want to
complicates. I just want to add one thing. The interesting thing from an operational point of view, it essentially complicates decision making, because what it does is it just creates a wider set of criteria that you have to take into consideration, which is one of the reasons why more and more organizations are going to these more rigorous decision-making frameworks and possibly systems to help them actually kind of manage that whole value concept that we're talking about here.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it brings me to my next question here around the social component, which is the least obvious component with ESG when it comes to power generation, but it's critical, especially since a number of us on this call have mentioned the importance of the customer and making sure decision-making is impacting them in the right way. And I'd love to hear from the panel about how these decisions are being made around which projects to deploy and how to deploy them, how the customer is being put in decision-making, and what considerations is impacting them. So,
I'll start there. Similar to Ben's organization, we're a rate-regulated utility, and so prudency of investment is kind of where the start of all of these discussions really go. For Evergy, we file an integrated resource plan with a 20-year time horizon in both states that we're in, which are Kansas and Missouri, and that is a stakeholder-based process. So different stakeholders participate in that docket, talk about the benefits and maybe challenges of particular resource plans over that 20-year time horizon. And although the net present value of the revenue requirement is, at the end of the day, the primary metric that's considered, lowest cost doesn't always win. There are other factors that are considered as we work towards finding the actual solution that we deploy. And as we saw in 2020 and 2021, supply chains around this stuff can move far more dynamically now that we're in the global space than we were when we were buying a generator from down the road and hanging some steel in the air. And so what you can procure and construct is a factor in that as well. But for us, the social thing really becomes paramount when we think about our lesser served or lesser privileged customers that we have. We have to democratize the access to these carbon-free assets. And for us, that really starts with kind of the superhighway backbone of our energy system, and that's the transmission grid. And so balancing the transmission investment with the renewables so that all of our customers benefit from a lower carbon future is paramount to those investment decisions.
No, that's great, Jason. Ben, any other thoughts on the customer decision-making to layer on?
I do. Jason did a good job of providing the backdrop of some of the fundamentals that, of course, I think most utilities use as they're evaluating large capital investments. Just maybe some additional thoughts as we've been spending more time thinking about how we can, integrate these investments in more community planning. To another one of Jason's points, really trying to be a catalyst for improving circumstances. I mentioned earlier, we've got a very rural footprint. Like everyone, we've got, some underserved communities. And one example is, with utilities, we've got a lot of infrastructure, and fiber is one of those aspects of our infrastructure that we're finding new ways to expand that network, and then create broadband initiatives where we'll have offtake from our dark fiber by ISPs, and really try to make an improvement on the digital divide that's become certainly more pronounced through the pandemic circumstances. Improving digital literacy. This will also improve access to remote work, virtual health, other key services that weren't necessarily top of mind for us 18 plus months ago. Just an opportunity. We talk about value stacking a lot when it comes to justification of assets, and really the value stacking now introduces a lot of these ESG qualities also. Another examples, we had a significant wind event take place through our Iowa service territory, a derecho, and recently we've made a commitment to plant 1 million trees. So it's a way for us to introduce investment. It aligns with our environmental stewardship, our corporate citizenship, and at the same time, provides betterment in the communities that we're serving.
Great, thanks, Ben, for all those examples. It's really clear that you're making steps and strides in a new and emerging space to deliver against customer expectations and needs. I do want to bring a question up from the audience that I'm appreciative of. Thanks, keep them coming. The question reads, what about addressing the lack of recycling opportunities or incentives for used, or more importantly, early replacement as panels become less costly and more efficient? Of course, this also applies to massive turbine blades as well, as they are not easily recycled or disposed of. So in essence, how are your organizations thinking about recycling or using recycled materials as part of your projects as you think about equipment sourcing?
Yeah, I think this gets to the whole, real scope 3 determination and how it's going to take the trust chain and the entire supply chain focused on this to build opportunities to redeploy materials all the way down. How do you take that silicon dioxide, grind it up, and reuse it in the panel technology of tomorrow? Utilities are typically not on the leading edge of that research and development, but we are certainly off-takers on deploying it in massive scales that few others can reach. And so Evergy historically has taken really good stewardship of the land resources that we have, and often do what we call brownfield deployments rather than greenfield sites. So rather than building something new on a new piece of property, take an area where we used to have a power plant and maybe now host a set of solar panels there. And so that recycling mindset is embedded deep within our culture. We reuse line routes, we reuse equipment often. And so as that supply chain and those level 3 emissions tracking grows, we'll be at the front of the line on finding creative ways to use that.
I would add to that, Andrew, I think utilities really have a place in driving the market when it comes to these types of topics. There's going to be other market players that are going to be more focused on short-term economic benefits for these projects. And while utilities are certainly interested in the short term, we make business cases all the time for long-term justification. And I think you're seeing the influence of that by turbine suppliers that are coming out with commitments that by certain dates, they're going to have blades and other components of the wind turbines be fully recyclable. We're making those types of requests, again, back to the bid events. We're very interested in life cycle costs and benefits for these projects. And so it's not going to be enough for any of these suppliers or manufacturers to deliver low-cost bids that don't advantage the full life cycle approach that we're very focused on.
Andrew, I was going to comment on that. Actually, the life cycle point is an interesting one. I think that utilities are often are challenged there. On the one hand, as good asset managers, you'd want to take a full life cycle approach, as Ben was just mentioning. But at times, you're incented to do the opposite, because in many regulatory regimes, you're essentially being rewarded for spending capital and not OPEX. So, that kind of pushes you towards replacing stuff maybe a bit too early. If you were in a different regulatory regime like you'd have in Europe, which is more life cycle based, then that might drive a more balanced approach. So there's also a regulatory component to all this, which very heavily influences decision making, of course, which might need rethinking certainly in some states.
No, it's a great perspective. The regulatory regime in the U.S. is clearly different than how it works otherwise, and it really does impact decision making around the idea of recycling. With that, I regret to inform you all that we are out of time. But I do thank you all for participating, all audience members for joining in and listening. I really appreciate the conversation. It's clear that power generation has going to play a huge role in ESG performance for many organizations, and the fact that the ESG will be interwoven will probably get more complicated before we figure it all out. So really appreciate the discussion from the panel. To the audience, if we didn't get a chance to manage or answer your questions, someone from the team will be in touch in the coming days. As a reminder, we will be sharing the recording with everyone who's registered, so you will receive an email from the team tomorrow with the link. Thanks again to the team here, Ben, Jason, and Budwin for this panel, Niraj and Aaron for the previous discussion. I really appreciate the conversation. I'm sure folks tuned in, enjoyed it too. So thanks again to our sponsor here, Copperleaf, for their support for today's session, and I hope you all enjoy your day. Take care.
Cheers.